As we dive into today's gripping story here beyond the surface, get ready for an emotional roller coaster filled with love, sacrifice, and unspoken tensions. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We have plenty more coming your way. Brad never imagined himself working 60-hour weeks, yet that becomes reality. Day after day, he found himself buried in a relentless cycle of overtime at the electrical company, sacrificing his free time for a future he and his fiancée, Gina, had been meticulously planning. For over a year, he had poured every extra shift, every weekend job, into their wedding savings account, determined to build a life they had envisioned together. His friends often joked that he had forgotten what sunlight looked like. While he laughed along with them, there was some truth to their teasing. His world had become nothing but wires, tools, and long hours. One afternoon, while rewiring a kitchen for an elderly client, Brad felt his phone buzz in his pocket. He hesitated, nearly ignoring the notification, but as he took a much-needed water break, he glanced at the screen. A message from Gina. Asterisk, did you think about Amy's wedding? Asterisk. Instantly, his stomach tightened. He had been with Gina for 3 years, long enough to read between the lines of her messages. This wasn't just a simple question. It was something more, something weighted with expectation. Their relationship had always felt strong. They had met at a barbecue hosted by his friend Dave, and since then, their bond had grown into something real, something worth fighting for. They had been building a future together, brick by brick. But now, the idea of spending money on someone else's wedding, when every dollar was supposed to be for theirs, felt absurd. Frustration flared as he quickly typed a response. Asterisk, we talked about this. We can't afford it right now. Asterisk, without waiting for a reply. He shoved his phone back into his pocket and climbed back up the ladder, determined to push the conversation out of his mind. By the time he finally made it home that evening, exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. Gina was waiting on the couch, still in her nursing scrubs, her face a mix of weariness and hope. Hey! She greeted softly, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. They exchanged the usual small talk about their days, but the tension in the room was thick, an unspoken argument hanging between them. Finally, Gina addressed the elephant in the room. Brad, Amy is my best friend. I need to be at her wedding. Her voice was calm, but there was a quiet determination behind it. Brad exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. Gina, I'm working my ass off for us. I'm not throwing away $6,000 on a wedding that isn't even ours. His voice rose unintentionally, frustration bleeding into his words. Gina's expression shifted from frustration to something deeper. Hurt. She pulled away slightly, and the silence that followed was heavier than any shouting match. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Brad stared at the ceiling, unable to shake the nagging feeling that he was missing something crucial. Why was this so important to Gina? They had their own wedding to plan. Every penny counted. Yet, she seemed unwilling to compromise. He turned to look at her, taking in the peaceful expression on her sleeping face. He loved her, that much he knew. But somehow, despite everything they had built together, this conflict cast a shadow over their future. The next morning, as Brad left for work, Gina watched him go, emotions churning inside her, gratitude for his hard work, frustration at their situation, and something else she wasn't quite ready to name. Gina had always believed that Brad loved her more than anyone she had ever known. They had spent years building a life together, working hard, saving money, and planning for a future that sometimes felt more like a checklist than a dream. Work, save, pay bills, rinse and repeat. It had all become so routine that she barely noticed how suffocating it was. One morning, as she sipped her coffee, her phone buzzed with a flood of messages. It was Amy, overflowed with excitement about her upcoming wedding in Cancun. Gina's stomach tightened. She hadn't told Amy yet that she might not be able to make it. She wanted to go, not just for Amy but for herself. One last adventure before stepping fully into the role of a devoted wife, with all the responsibilities that came with it. But there was a problem. Their shared budget, carefully crafted by Brad, left little room for anything outside their long-term plans. Every cent was accounted for, every expense justified. At first, She had admired his discipline, but over time, it had started to feel less like financial responsibility and more like control. When had she started feeling like she needed permission to spend her own money? At work, Amy finally confronted her about it. Why are you letting him decide how you spend your money? You have your own paycheck, too, she pressed. The words stung because Gina knew they were true. When had she started surrendering all financial decisions to Brad? Yes, he was careful, but at some point careful had turned into absolute. It was as if her role in their relationship was simply to nod along while he mapped out their future. As the days passed, the tension between them simmered. Brad was working long hours, and Gina felt increasingly isolated. The argument with Amy replayed in her mind over and over. She wrestled with the idea of telling Brad that she was going to Amy's wedding no matter what. But fear held her back. What if he reacted badly? One evening, exhausted and overwhelmed, she found herself at Amy's apartment, surrounded by wedding plans and excitement. Amy encouraged her to take a stand. If he really loves you, he'll support your decision, she insisted. The idea stuck with Gina, but it didn't sit right. Making her attendance at the wedding non-negotiable felt manipulative. Was it fair to force Brad's hand? Or was she simply trying to reclaim a part of herself that had slowly slipped away? Back home, the air between them was thick with unspoken words. When Brad finally returned from work, drained and ready to unwind, she sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through pictures of the stunning resort where Amy's wedding would take place. The planner called today. Brad said, trying to shift the conversation toward something productive. We need to pick a date for our wedding. But Gina had reached her breaking point. What about what I want? She blurted out. Don't I get a say in how we spend our money? The words ignited something between them. The frustration that had been building for months erupted into a full-blown argument. Brad's voice rose. I'm the one working long hours to make sure we have a future. And what about experiences? Gina countered. What about living? I don't want to miss my best friend's wedding just because every dollar has to fit into a spreadsheet. Then, before she could stop herself, the words tumbled out. If you don't help me go to Amy's wedding, I don't see how we can move forward. The silence that followed was deafening. Brad stared at her, disbelief written all over his face. You're threatening our relationship over vacation? I'm not, she insisted, but the damage was done. The ultimatum had been cast, intentional or not. Brad exhaled sharply, then wordlessly opened his laptop. A few keystrokes later, he transferred money from their joint wedding fund into her personal account. Use it for your trip, he said coldly. Clearly, it means more to you than our future. Panic gripped her as she watched him grab a duffel bag. You're leaving? She asked, voice trembling. Brad slung the bag over his shoulder. I'll stay at a friend's place for a while. You're breaking up with me over this? We were supposed to get married, he said simply, but the weight in his voice made it clear. Something had fundamentally shifted between them. As the door shut behind him, regret washed over Gina. Had she pushed too hard? Had she really been so desperate for one trip that she was willing to risk everything? Amy's wedding was beautiful, the beach breathtaking, the laughter contagious. But even as she stood beside her best friend, a gnawing emptiness clung to her. She had won the battle for her independence, but at what cost? Brad had worked tirelessly to build a future for them, and now that future was gone. The realization hit hardest when she returned to her new apartment, smaller, lonelier. The financial freedom she had fought for came with its own price tag, bills, rent, and a personal loan she had taken out to cover expenses now that she was on her own. She picked up extra shifts at work, trying to make ends meet, but the loneliness was unbearable. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had accused Brad of being controlling, yet he had only been trying to build stability. She, on the other hand, had chased a fleeting moment of happiness, only to find herself more lost than ever as she sat in her empty apartment. Staring at the walls, the weight of her decision pressed down on her. No beach vacation, no matter how beautiful, had been worth the price of losing someone who would truly care for her and their future together.